it's very clear, no matter whether the outcome is through military means or some sort of diplomacy that is a momentary thing, that region is not going to go back to any status quo ante. And in one respect, looking at the kind of longer scope of the history of the Western powers, first the British and French, and now the US, emerging as the dominant powers within this entire vital Middle East region, I think we're seeing the final end of the latter-day remnants of Sykes-Picot. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French, with the United States getting special relationship with Turkey, carved up the Middle East into Western European, Western power spheres of influence. When the Saudis said no to the United States using the bases for Operation Project Freedom to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, to my mind, that greatly signaled the end of that sort of Sykes-Picot 2.0 in which the United States took over from Britain and France.
Well, welcome back to the Heroes Path podcast. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. One quick note before we start. In last week's episode, toward the end, Jeff and I talked about the Thucydides trap, the concept that when a rising power challenges an established one, the pull towards conflict becomes almost structural. We said that it was the frame through which to understand everything happening between the United States and China right now, with Iran as more of an accelerant. And then 2 days later, at the opening of the Beijing summit on May 14th, Xi looked across the table at President Trump and asked publicly, can China and the United States transcend the Thucydides trap and pioneer a new paradigm of major country relations? Everybody covered it. The Guardian covered it. Time covered it. Euronews, Cornell, Newsweek, Fox News. So that phrase we discussed on this podcast went to the center of the most consequential diplomatic meeting, arguably, of the year. So, Jeff, I think that we might have some listeners in Beijing.
Yeah.
It's crazy, but when you get to Xi's invocation of the Thucydides trap and actually what it meant and what it didn't. But first, I think we're, now 80 days in, the war that was supposed to last 4 to 6 weeks, the MOU that was supposed to close within 48 hours of our last recording. And then we talked about the April Consumer Price Index that dropped last Tuesday and the Beijing summit that produced more symbolism and a Taiwan warning. And on Iran, many outlets called few wins. So there's a lot that was discussed, a lot that's happened over the past week. But Jeff, you've been with us every week since day one. You've been the right guide for the moment when the diplomatic track and the military track are running in opposite directions at the same time. So Jeff, thanks very much for coming back.
It's another one of those moments where things could tilt either in the direction of diplomacy or a major escalation.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about just quickly the Consumer Price Index. That came out Tuesday. We flagged it 3 weeks running as a date to watch. What did that number say, and what do you think it means?
I think there are two numbers to look at. Consumer Price Index was up 3.8%. And for one thing, regardless of the fact that Trump's guy was confirmed as the new chairman of the Fed, the Federal Reserve is going to have a very hard time with any of the interest rate cuts that Trump has been pushing since the day he came back into office. Even more significant than the consumer price index, the producer price index was up 6%. And that translates into increasing pass-along consumer price spikes over the next 3-6 months. So we're looking at a situation that's continuing to go the wrong way in terms of economic consequences. 7 of the 10 largest foreign governments holding U.S. treasuries have been reducing their holdings, selling off their treasuries. And that includes both China and Japan, who've been major purchasers. Britain is the only large purchaser of U.S. treasuries that net increased their holdings last month. And it's reflective of the situation vis-a-vis Iran, as you said a moment ago. It's the accelerant, but it was not the trigger of the process. It's an accelerant of a diminishing confidence in the role of the U.S. dollar to be maintained as the global reserve currency. The fact that Trump announced earlier today that he was not moving ahead with planned military resumption of escalated attacks against Iran today was the result of interventions by Gulf Arab countries and Turkey and Pakistan. So you see those countries that are major economic partners of the U.S. The Saudi is the guarantor that oil trade is denominated in U.S. dollars. They're distancing themselves from Washington.
Yeah.
So I think the bigger picture is one in which this war is having substantially more collateral damage than anybody in the administration expected.
Yeah. Well, and Edward Jones noted that with the Strait of Hormuz now still effectively shuttered, the risk that we're not past the peak of those price pressures is rising further. And Lloyd said this week that as of May 7th, there's been no transit since May 4th. So where are we on the Strait of Hormuz?
The Iranians have demonstrated a capability of basically keeping it either open or shut based on which ships are transiting. There are some ships that are getting through, but there are countries that have very carefully avoided being identified as Iran's adversaries. There were ships that got through during the summit meeting that had oil and gas bound for China. And Japan is on the accepted list, so is India. But any countries economically engaged with Israel, any countries that are part of the NATO structures are going to be shut out. And the Iranians understand oil geopolitics. They know that the mere threat of drone attacks or fast boat attacks means that the major insurance companies are going to either charge skyrocketing risk premiums or they're simply not going to issue insurance policies for any ship trying to cross through the straits. So that's the nature of the shipping industry, the insurance side of it. So they've got it basically shut. And the evaluation that was reported a few days ago in the Washington Post directly from the CIA is that Iran has the ability to basically sustain that shutdown for 3 to 4 months without suffering any really dramatic economic dislocation that could lead to social unrest.
Hey, Jeff, of course, you and I had lunch in West Palm Beach last week, and something that you mentioned during that lunch I thought was really interesting. You said that there's a back door that hasn't really been discussed yet either. I think is it through the Caspian Sea? Is that what you were mentioning?
That's correct.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, a naval blockade of Iran that does not shut down the Iranian transit through the Caspian Sea is a joke, frankly. The Caspian Sea borders Russia, a number of countries in that region, and a large part of the northern coast of Iran. So there are oil shipments that are going out by sea through that route. There are trucking routes that have been built up extensively in recent years. It's called the Northeast International Transportation Corridor, and it basically provides an uninterrupted transit route from Russia through into Iran, and the intention is from there for it to continue on to India. There are truck routes that the Iranians are now using heading up into Central Asia. And of course, I think it's also important to bear in mind that Russian President Putin, as we speak, is in Beijing, and he's talking with President Xi, among other things, about finalizing the deal to build the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline that would basically completely offset the shutoff of Russian gas supplies to Europe. So from the standpoint of Iran and Russia as a strategic partner, these backdoor routes have strategic implication for sure.
Yeah. Well, so Jeff, let's go to Beijing for a second. So May 14th, May 15th was Trump's first visit to China in years and really the most anticipated summit of the decade. So walk us through what happened and what that means for Iran.
Well, as you mentioned, right at the very start of the summit, at the beginning of the opening diplomatic session with representatives of both governments seated around the big table, Xi Jinping drew the parallel to the Thucydides trap, the warning of that. Mm-hmm. And basically, what it was saying is China's a rising power, America is a static or perhaps declining power, and trumps it off, whether he fully understands the implications of that or not. But that being said, the summit was successful for a number of reasons. Ambassador Chas Freeman, who was the translator for the very first Nixon trip to China back in the 70s, and then served as the chargé d'affaires at the embassy for a number of years after normalization, basically pointed out that as long as the United States and China are talking, and there's a clear demonstration of mutual back and forth respect between Xi Jinping and Trump, this is a good thing. It's an indication of stability. The real work that went on during the summit was done by Treasury Secretary Bessent, U.S. Trade Representative Greer, and Li Hefeng, who's the chief Chinese economic advisor and negotiator. And they've set up a U.S.-China Board of Trade and a separate Board of Investment that will be a way to regulate trade balance between the U.S. and China to maintain it and bypass a lot of the disruptive factors within Congress, within the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which tend to be obstacles to a smooth flow of U.S.-China trade. So from that standpoint, and of course the presence of dozens of major U.S. corporate CEOs, China confirmed the purchase of 200 commercial jetliners from Boeing. The Commerce Ministry confirmed that there'll be a substantial expansion of soybean and other agricultural imports from the U.S. So I think the basic message is that at least there's people in Washington and certainly in Beijing who understand that there's a kind of a mutually assured destruction that exists between the U.S. and China in the economic domain, not so much the nuclear weapons domain, but that there's got to be a modicum of cooperation. And so they've basically defined guardrails on the relationship, and that's, generally speaking, a healthy outcome.
Yeah, it's always good to hear a little bit of optimism coming out of this. But it's interesting though. We talk about the Thucydides trap. Xi framing it was pretty precise, pretty deliberate when you think about it. But the guy that created this, as I recall, it was Graham Allison,
Correct,
from Harvard, and he popularized the term not even 10 years ago in 2017. And I believe he was at this summit in an informal capacity too, which was really significant. And he observed the summit's big word would be stabilization. As you look at this, what does it mean? Xi was actually communicating that I'm the rising Athens, you are the established Sparta. 12 of 16 cases in history ended in war. Let's not try to be, or rather, let's try to be in the 4 that didn't end in conflict. But I think what's notable, though, is he did not say that they could do that. There was no optimism there on his part at all.
In fact, he made very clear that the issue that could spring the Thucydides trap is Taiwan.
Yes.
Very strong language on the Taiwan issue. And I think one of the other important elements of the summit that we know the least about is that on Friday, just shortly before Trump left on Air Force One to come back home, he was invited to basically the headquarters, the nerve center of China, of the Chinese Communist Party, the compound, formerly the Imperial Gardens, where Xi Jinping resides, where the Standing Committee has their offices and other members of the Standing Committee reside there. Very few foreign leaders have ever been invited there. And my impression is that during that discussion, Xi Jinping went through a fairly detailed, kind of watered down, but nevertheless clear version of what the Taiwan issue actually means for China. Mm-hmm. When Trump got back home, one of the first comments that he made afterwards was that he's not particularly interested in fighting a war 8,900 miles away from the nearest U.S. coastline. And so the issue of $14 billion in arms sales to Taiwan is hanging in the air, and it's very doubtful that Trump will decide to approve it, certainly not before September 24th when she's coming to Washington.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The rhetoric, I think, has a way of catching up with us if we're not careful.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about parallels, Jeff. We talked about the Suez Crisis, 1956. I won't get into that, but of course, that was July 1956. The United States intervened against its own allies there. President Eisenhower was the president. He was furious and not being consulted. And that matters, of course, because it is a parallel. It's probably the most uncomfortable one for Washington. The United States and Israel launched this operation in Iran, Epic Fury, with the expectation that the militarily degraded Iran would quickly capitulate. That has not happened. But there are other parallels as well. Let's talk about some of those. You had mentioned the one that came immediately to mind was World War II, Pearl Harbor, right?
Right. Roosevelt wanted to bring the United States into the war, particularly against Hitler. And he was facing every year, Congress, by large bipartisan margins, passed neutrality acts that placed absolute clear limits on any U.S. engagement. By 1939, 1940, he scratched out concessions on cash and carry and then lend-lease. But in the case of Japan, it was the U.S. blockade that really functioned as a sort of a provocation that almost assured that the Japanese would attack. And there's a history that goes back to Harry Dexter White and the negotiations around Bretton Woods, where White was really one of the adamant hardliners that wanted war with the Axis powers and therefore played a kind of a critical role in pushing when the Japanese were looking to negotiate an agreement to end the blockade and make some concessions. He shut the door on whether that was fully at Roosevelt's urging or not. And so here we've got a case where a blockade has functioned as an act of war. And so in the minds of the Japanese high command, Pearl Harbor was a retaliation, not an initiation. And so I think there's a lot of historical parallels to be seen in digging deeply into that situation.
Well, and I think the lesson of 1941 isn't that blockades always are going to lead to more Pearl Harbors. The lesson is that a blockaded party experiencing the pressure, as you mentioned, as existential, may calculate that the costs of desperate action are lower than the cost of submission, right? And that blockading power may not be ready for what it triggers. And I don't think that we really thought through those second and third order effects.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. What other parallels can you think of that apply here? And I think there's plenty too. One of the things that I was thinking about was if you look back just to 1980, 1988, you had the Iran-Iraq War, Operation Praying Mantis. You want to talk a little bit about that, Jeff?
Well, the Iran-Iraq War precipitated a number of things. The countries of the Persian Gulf outside of Iraq and Iran felt threatened by the instability that war brought. They created the Gulf Cooperation Council in direct response to how that war was proceeding. And of course, the United States was basically playing for the continuation of that war. Initially, we were supporting the Iranians clandestinely through what came to be the whole Iran-Contra affair. There's a deep irony in the fact that Israel was our partner in providing ballistic missiles to Iran to fight against Iraq, because at that moment, the Israelis saw Saddam Hussein as a greater threat than Iran.
Right.
And even though the Iranians had just had a revolution, overthrown the Shah, who had been an ally of Israel within the Cold War framework in the Middle East, and then at a later point in the war, when it was tilting too strongly in Iran's direction, and of course, we're talking now about the period after the student takeover of the U.S. Embassy students, really, they were the first generation of the IRGC.
Right.
Later, we shifted in the mid-'80s to supporting Iraq. I had a dear personal friend, John, who you knew also, Colonel Pat Lang.
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
And he was sent over in 1985 to Iraq to help them restructure their combat operations in order to counter the Iranian human waves, which were starting to take their toll on tilting the war in Iran's favor. And so for the next 3 years, the U.S. was engaged in flipping sides in order to keep that kind of balance of warfare going. And
Yeah.
ultimately,
That was what? That was 1988, I think, wasn't it?
88, it came to an end.
Yeah. Well, during that time, we were escorting Kuwaiti tankers that had been reflagged as American vessels. There,
Oh,
there
yeah.
was a lot of things that were going on that are direct parallels to what we're seeing today. And oh, by the way, we destroyed nearly half of Iran's operational navy in a single day then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, then from the end of that war, we fairly quickly moved into the targeting of Saddam Hussein. You had the Kuwait invasion, the initial operation to liberate Kuwait under President George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, that happened within 2 years of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And then the legacy of that really led to George W. Bush coming into office with a clear intention of regime change in Iraq,
Yeah.
which preceded 9/11.
So many different lessons from all of these. One of them is that even if you come up with a ceasefire, if they leave underlying disputes intact, then they have a way of producing the next war.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. A lot of other parallels too, but I think those are the ones that immediately come to mind. Anything else that you want to add, Jeff?
Well, I think it's just important that certain things have really not changed. We get a lot of flurries of activity. Today we're going to bomb, tomorrow we're waiting. There's really only two outcomes. Either some sort of a diplomatic resolution, which leaves all of the underlying issues unresolved, because Iran, if there's a diplomatic solution that falls short of a complete collapse of the current regime, then it's a perfect example of what you just mentioned. A war ending with a kind of an armistice situation that virtually guarantees the next war, particularly because Israel is adamant about the need for full-blown, unambiguous regime change in Iran. They want Reza Pahlavi as their first choice, but they want a pro-Western, unambiguous tilt in Iran. And of course, the other polar extreme, the other option, is that there is an escalation and the war escalates, but escalates to the point that regime change is the only alternative. And that's something that is going to require a lot more American resources, unquestionably including ground troops. And that's a hard sell to the American people, particularly going into these critical midterm elections.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a stalemate situation that doesn't lend itself to an easy answer, especially because the Iranians are themselves in no rush to reach a compromise that really doesn't satisfy their concerns about guarantees that there's not going to simply be another attack by the U.S. and Israel a year from now after military assets have been replenished.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are still in flux, extremely complex situation still, even as things start to get clouded over, we're at a pretty critical time, and that's obvious. And this isn't just a Middle East story. It's not just a uniquely Iran 2026 story. There are plenty of different historic precedents that we can all look back on. Ultimately, it's a system story, as we talked about several weeks ago, but it's really about what happens when you have all these different dimensions of military and national power all coming together, everything from energy and war and diplomacy, and then you throw in some nuclear risk and some economic fragility combined, and all those collide into a system that's really lost the institutional capacity to manage any one of them.
It's very clear, no matter whether the outcome is through military means or some sort of diplomacy that is a momentary thing, that region is not going to go back to any status quo ante. And in one respect, looking at the kind of longer scope of the history of the Western powers, first the British and French, and now the U.S., emerging as the dominant powers within this entire vital Middle East region, I think we're seeing the final end of the latter-day remnants of Sykes-Picot. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French, with the United States getting special relationship with Turkey, carved up the Middle East into Western European, Western power spheres of influence. When the Saudis said no to the United States using the bases for Operation Project Freedom to reopen the Straits of Hormuz. To my mind, that greatly signaled the end of that sort of Sykes-Picot 2.0 in which the United States took over from Britain and France.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought and really a pretty compelling one when you consider it all in its totality. And could not agree with you more. I think that this is something that we're going to look back on and say this was a turning point, certainly for the United States, but also globally for all major powers. But to Jeff Steinberg, thanks for helping us see all these patterns and not just the events themselves. And to our listeners, stay informed, stay grounded, stay curious. This is Colonel John Fenzel. Thanks for listening to the Heroes Path podcast.